Carla Shapreau teaches art and cultural property law at the School of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is also a senior fellow in the Institute of European Studies, where she conducts cultural property research regarding music-related losses during the Nazi era. Ms. Shapreau is also a violin maker and curator of the Zaltz collection of stringed instruments in the Department of Music at the University of California, Berkeley. She's also an attorney in her spare time. In her printed bio in the Symposium program books, you will note that she is the co-author of 2 books and that she has written many articles and lectured widely on the topic of cultural property, and in particular on topics related to the looting of musical cultural property by the Nazi regime. I suspect many of you will have read her article a couple of years ago titled "A Nazi Violin Still Keeps Its Secrets," that prominently appeared in the New York Times Sunday Arts and Leisure section and was the most widely read article that week. I also expect that most of you have seen the film The Monuments Men, which brought the issue of Nazi-looted visual art to the attention of the public at large. Now, to speak on contextualizing cultural property, interpretation and perception of Nazi-era looted or blacklisted works is, in a scholarly way, a modern-day musical material monuments woman, Carla Shapreau.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank the Coburn School of Music and the Zirin Conlon Initiative for Recovered Voices, Maestro Conlon, Mike Beckerman, and Bob Elias, the director of the Initiative for Recovered Voices, for inviting me to contribute today. I'm a little bit of an outlier. I'm not a musicologist. I'm not a performer. But as Bob has mentioned, I come to this topic because of my research at UC Berkeley on music-related losses during the Nazi era. And by music-related losses, I mean manuscripts, autograph and otherwise, printed music, sometimes very rare, and rare books, musical instruments, and other musicalia that were confiscated by the Nazi authorities, otherwise stolen, displaced, lost, or sold under duress because of the Nazi era. And in considering our symposium topic, how should we perform the troubled past, I considered the musical works of persecuted composers, as well as, and primarily, musical material culture swept up in this history as a result of looting, along with the lives tethered to these objects. I wanted to start with a quote by Walter Benjamin, a German Jewish philosopher and cultural critic, who said in 1936, let's see if this works. Let's see. Great, okay. So Walter Benjamin said, "The authenticity of a thing is the essence of all that is transmissible from its beginning, ranging from its substantive duration to its testimony to the history which it has experienced. And what is really jeopardized when the historical testimony is affected is the authority of the object." Benjamin was considering the impact of mechanical reproduction on works of art in an article that this was taken from, but his comment speaks in part to the issue of provenance. Provenance is the history of ownership or possession of a material object, such as a musical manuscript. Benjamin doesn't use authenticity in the typical sense. Is a work what it purports to be? Is it genuine, which might disregard the object's provenance? So provenance, if traceable, may illuminate the cultural, social, historical, or political context of a creative work. And provenance is often the portal to the object biography and the lives connected to it, to a whole history, to layers of history. So our symposium topic, by implication, raises questions of whether, if, and why we should somehow contextualize a musical work's troubled past into its interpretation, its programming, performance, and into the listening experience. Do we ever come to musical composition or other cultural work in a pure sense? I don't think so. There is no zero. Isn't interpretation and perception generally moderated, explicitly or implicitly? If we are after some sort of historical truth about a cultural work, the interpretation or curation of such a work will involve selection, just as any nonfiction work results in choices. If pertinent information is lost or elusive, if new information later surfaces, our understanding of a work may shift. But objective contextualization of a musical work within its troubled past doesn't ghettoize the work in that past, in my view. It contributes to the work's meaning. Such contextual references may eventually fall away for the interpreting performer and the listening public, but the benefits of this knowledge seem to outweigh the detriments. For those of you who aren't familiar with provenance, because it's such a huge part of what my research involves, and it ties into this topic, I just want to go over a couple of slides to talk about that. So provenance is important for several reasons. It can inform authenticity. Is a work truly an authentic manuscript or a Stradivarius? It can affect ownership if something is stolen. Understanding the provenance can tell us a great deal. It can affect value depending on the history of the object, who owned it. And of course, it's a window into the object biography. And what do I mean by provenance in terms of evidence? It's pretty much, there's an endless possibilities here, but programming material could be a possibility. Dealer records if an object changed hands. Iconography, exhibition history, publication history. And in the case of Paul Herman, we have personal records, photographs of things that could be important, many, many things. So I want to discuss some analogies to musical works suppressed during the Nazi era to the extent a few alternative scenarios might be of some use. So I want to start actually with a Mozart manuscript. So clearly, of course, Mozart is wasn't blacklisted and isn't involved in this time period, but this particular manuscript, it's a violin sonata in G major, Crucial 379, written in 1789, was confiscated during the Nazi era from its Jewish owner, a man named Oskar Bondy, an Austrian industrialist who collected fine art and significant musical autographs and instruments. So when one studies this sonata, it's today housed in the Library of Congress, fortunately, where the public has access to it. You can see a still vibrant ink stamp affixed to the fox paper fibers of the first and last pages of the manuscript. The stamp bears the name of the National Bibliothek in Vienna, the music collection, and this might cause a musician studying the manuscript or performing from it to wonder about the history of the manuscript. How did it get there? And how did it end up in the Library of Congress in its very long history? So I'll spare you most of the provenance, but the manuscript was sold at auction in 1929 in Berlin, which is where Oskar Bondy acquired it. He then, when the Anschluss took place, he fled Austria to Switzerland. He made it to New York. Unfortunately, he died in 1944. He left a widow behind, and his property in Vienna was confiscated. It was seized. And as a result of my research, I photographed a couple of other records so that, just to give you an idea of, with material culture, the depth of understanding and history that can come into these stories. This is Oskar Bondy, and this is a property card. It's in the Austrian government archive, and this documents the actual initial 1938 confiscation of his collection of musical autographs. There's not much there. But then in another archive in town, in Vienna, I found an inventory dated about 2 years later, where, as you can see, I cut and pasted number 1 on the list, which is this Mozart manuscript. And these autographs were actually in the State Bibliothek in Vienna. They were up for dibs, actually, as were many other musical items on so-called wish lists for the state museums and archives. And that is how this particular manuscript was accessioned into Austria's National Library, and thus the purple ink stamp. So fortunately, after the war, the Bondys did recover this manuscript in 1948. But in Austria, what also happened was, in many cases, materials that had been looted were returned, but in exchange for coerced donations of other objects or long-term loans. That happened with the Bondis. It happened with many other claimants. But in any case, in 1949, Mrs. Bondi sold this manuscript to Gertrude Clark Whitall, who donated it to the Library of Congress Music Division. So when people perform on this manuscript in the Library of Congress, there is, and I think this is an important point, they've actually, in programming materials, there is some mention of this history. They don't know about these other records, and maybe we can create an exhibition about this to give further history to it, but there is some mention of it, but in the catalog of the manuscript, I didn't see this history. But this is one example of how music with a troubled past might be curated for the public at large. Different subject, but certainly related to our conference topic. In contrast, an 18th century carved, it's a violin case, was also looted from Oscar Bondi. Here you see the property card for that. And he had an inventory. This was item number 1148. So the picture on the left is actually the inside of the case. It has the same number. And this instrument is actually in the Metz collection. And the provenance listed is merely Oscar Bondi. It went through the Blumke Gallery. Blumke was also a refugee from Vienna who came to New York and was a dealer. But you wouldn't know this history. Whether that's important or not, I guess it's a question up for debate. I think it's important, and I think this is actually a new area in the curation of, certainly for musical objects, it's very rare. In fairness to the Met, linking up Nazi-era provenance to curated objects in the musical field, not so much art, is a fairly new topic. And what makes it particularly difficult is that provenance information, it's not often preserved. It can be very difficult to find. And it hasn't really been the focal point for much scholarly research. But this exhibition, I think, raises the question, how should we curate and exhibit significant cultural works with a troubled past, such as fine art, just as we're asking today what role this history might play in the interpretation and performance of musical compositions. So I want to switch to fine art for a second to give you an analogy, and I'm here, for the most part, maybe giving you more analogies than being a direct hit on our topic. But I want to talk about two paintings because a similar issue has come up. Here you see the portrait of Wally by Egon Schiele. This painting was in a very heated legal dispute in the United States. It came here, was looted from a family in Austria. But after 10 years, there was a settlement, a $19 million settlement. The painting went back to the museum in Vienna that originally had it. But there was a requirement, a stipulation that the exhibition history be exhibited with the painting. That was part of the settlement. The history of the victim and the history of the painting. And then there's this painting, which you probably all know about, Adele Bloch-Bauer 1, The Woman in Gold, and the subject of a recent movie, which many of you may have seen. So this was similarly the subject of litigation, a long battle, a settlement eventually in mediation in Vienna, where Maria Altmann, the niece of the subject in the painting, got title to the painting. And it was sold in 2006 for $130 million to Ronald Lauder, and it is the centerpiece at the Neue Gallery in New York today. Now when this first went, so you see there's signage here too, but when this first went up, and for several years there was no signage. And what's interesting to me and what I want to share with you is in 2010, a Wall Street Journal article was written titled, "What is Lost When Works Are Trophies?" Tom Freudenheim, a distinguished museum professional, criticized the use of museum exhibition signage like this, stating, "It's interesting to contemplate how works of art, which museums generally want us to appreciate for their aesthetic values, can turn into trophies, emblems of issues or events that have nothing to do with their status as art." He was speaking of the portrait of Wally, because at the time Adele Bloch-Bauer didn't have this signage. And regarding the portrait of Wally, he said, "What permanently locks Schiele's painting into this alternative, extra-artistic perceptual universe is the clause in the settlement agreement stipulating that the painting had to be shown with its provenance." Freudenheim reasoned that the exhibition signage with this provenance, raised the question of the role of the art museum in, quote, satisfying both our natural curiosity about what's newsworthy and our ability to focus on what is, above all, meant to be understood visually, close quote. He suggested that curating the artwork with its Nazi-era past reinforced a narrow identity for the object as a Nazi-era artifact. For this history, he suggested that serious curiosity can increasingly be satisfied on museum websites where you can put ancillary information. And then he finishes with, quote, this makes it possible for the museum visit to encourage its one unique experience, the art experience. So the museum curator's role is analogous to the role of those interpreting, programming, and performing recovered musical voices from a troubled past. And with all due respect to Mr. Freudenheim, the value of provenance information and other historical information, from my perspective, goes beyond what might be newsworthy. Creative cultural works, such as musical manuscripts, will have a nexus with political, cultural, social, or historical events or issues because they aren't created in a vacuum. Objective information regarding a work's provenance may enhance its meaning for the viewer or listener. Such objective information should be distinguished from exaggeration, manipulation, or distortion of facts, and we've heard about that today. Now, that can be a slippery slope. Where does objectivity begin and where does exaggeration or manipulation pick up? So the Mozart Sonata I started with is, of course, a well-recognized work in the canon, but in contrast, suppressed and blacklisted musical works are often little known or unknown, such as Paul Herman, thankfully, which has now been brought to our attention. I just want to show you these composers, as well as musicians, were blacklisted in published materials such as this. This is the 1940 Lexicon of Jews in Music, and this was published in 3 editions, 1940, 41, and 43. And similarly, I guess part of that is cut off. This is the Austrian Copyright Society's membership list. They're basically drawing red lines through the members who were Jewish, and those were composers, authors, and music publishers. And so this kind of raises the question, little known or unknown compositions suppressed during the Nazi era raise questions such as, does the work have aesthetic merit? And how do we objectively judge merit? Does contextualizing these works within its history detract from, contribute to, or otherwise impact an objective evaluation of little or unknown works? And you've been hearing about this today. I wanted to just throw in a few little legal things because I thought this was so interesting. On the issue of judging aesthetic merit, we actually have legislation in the United States that provides a measuring stick for visual art. In 1990, the US Congress enacted what's called the Visual Artists' Rights Act. It's a moral rights statute, and it grants to authors and artists a legal right in attribution and the integrity of qualifying visual art. I'm going to switch to this. So in Europe, moral rights covers music and other areas of creative efforts. In the US, visual art is up on a pedestal. And the point I wanted to make was that our moral rights legislation grants authors the right to prevent a work's destruction. You can only destroy it or prevent destruction if you can prove that the work is of recognized stature. So there's a way to judge it. And the case law has developed this. What does this mean? How do we measure this? And the case law has come up with this standard. It's basically expert testimony and other testimony by recognized art experts, other members of the artistic community, or some cross-section of society. Really not that different than what we're doing informally as a community and various other communities. Of course, the passage of time and other changing circumstances can affect how we view the merits of a composition over time. So I want to, this is Paul Herman, by the way, and I want to thank his grandson for providing this photo. And, you know, for me, I'm thinking about the cello. When I heard about this, I asked Bob, what about the cello? And there's actually a very dramatic story with the cello. Unlike many musical objects that were confiscated, this wasn't confiscated, but first of all, it's a it was made by Alessandro Galiano, at least that's what we believe, probably in the early 18th century. Would be a rare and very important instrument. And this instrument was given to Paul by a patron who later became a member of the family. And I'm sure it meant a great deal to him. For those of you who are musicians, and even those of you who aren't, you know how strong that connection is between an instrument and the player. And it may be that Paul actually composed some of his works on this cello. And so when he was arrested in April of 1944, in Toulouse in a roundup, his apartment was sealed with a cello inside. And thanks to his landlady, got word to a relative who apparently came by bicycle from another town with he broke into the apartment, he rescued the cello, replacing it with a lesser valued cello. And after the war, returned it to the family. But the question I suppose I want to ask when we think about this cello is, would you want to know if you were at a concert? Well, hopefully we'll find this cello. We're working on it, but we'll see. Would it matter to you to know that this was this cello? Would it mean something? Would it mean something to the performer or any of the characters in the various facets of thinking about these things? Okay, so I could tell you so many stories, but I'm just going to throw a few other stories having to do with instruments up, but it raises the same question. Here we have a harpsichord. I don't think anybody has probably seen this image before. Wanda Landowska, who you may know of, was a Polish Jew who lived in Paris, and there was a very significant musical confiscation in France involving her. So her case file, for me, it's very significant, first because it was so large, but it was also important from a historical perspective because the French government protested to the Germans about this confiscation, and they referred to the property as part of the French artistic heritage. Very interesting. Of course, the Nazis ignored it. They shipped a very large quantity of Landowska's musical materials to Germany. They later evacuated these things because of the bombing to Bavaria, this particular item to Bavaria, where luckily the US in 1945 discovered it. And you can see it here. It's in Munich in a collecting depot without its legs, it's been around. Today, it's in South Africa, which is kind of interesting. But there's no mention by the institution of its history, none. Somebody has posted something about it. There's an inaccuracy in what they posted, actually, but there is some mention. But again, it raises the issue of curation. And I also want to show you, this is an image from Guillaume de Michel's 14th century manuscript, known as the Farrell Vogue manuscript, which has significant value to medieval studies encompassing music, literature, and art at the highest levels. So this was confiscated in Paris from a bank vault of its owner in 1940. And the work is 392 leaves. 118 of those are music. It was again discovered after the war by the US. I could talk to you about things that haven't been recovered, but this has been recovered. And, but the point I want to make is reconstructing the manuscript's Nazi-era past and the associated profound dislocation of culture to which it fell victim for a time is one chapter in its 700-year history. And it does provide a new context for reconsidering the manuscript's continuing importance to our cultural heritage. Until 2014, this history was in large part unknown. And this context, if we are to understand, and this context is important if we're to understand our past in the present and in the future. The last example I want to show you, so I've been talking about why I think context is important. I want to talk to you about what happens when we decontextualize. So here you see an image. It's moving to archaeology, a little off our topic, but a useful analogy, hopefully. These are 23 figurines from the 7th century, created by Mayan artists, found in El Peru, Huaca, in northern Guatemala. And on the left, you see it as the archaeologists found the figurines. On the right, they're cleared up. And what's interesting to me is this is actually a performance. So we have an image of the ritual performance, according to the archaeologist involved with the study of this tomb. These figurines depict a performance associated with the burial of a king. The deceased king is kneeling in a supplication pose with hands across his chest. His head is gently leaning to one side, listening to a magical deer, and the deer is praying over the dead king. The assemblage includes dwarfs, shaman, and humans, and depicts the deceased kings on his ritual journey into the afterlife. And this includes references to the sea, the wind, and other facts of Mayan culture. But when we decontextualize, and here you see a similar figurine for sale last year at Sotheby's, it becomes commodified. And we lose the cultural clues, the relationships, the mythology, the deeper meaning of the cultural work. And this item was taken from the island of Jana in the Yucatan Peninsula, which was a burial ground for the Maya nobility. And that island was torn apart in the 1940s because of looting. And so we have virtually no information other than that it came from Jana in the approximate time frame because of that. So I framed my talk today around musical and other material culture, which is known as cultural property. And I want to just briefly tell you about that term of art. Cultural property is a defined term in international legal instruments. In the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, so during war, that was came to be enacted after World War II because of all of the loss. And then in the 1970 UNESCO Convention, which regulates in peacetime the movement of cultural objects that could be looted or inappropriately transferred. So in War and Peace, we have defined these cultural objects as cultural property. It includes the musical manuscripts we're talking about today. And I just wanted to mention this excerpt from the preamble. 131 member states have signed on to this. Cultural property constitutes one of the basic elements of civilization and national culture, and that its true value can be appreciated only in relation to the fullest possible information regarding its origin, history, and traditional setting. So I want to end with a remark by musicologist, music historian, and critic Professor Richard Taruskin, mentioned twice today, regarding the San Francisco Symphony Mavericks concert programming, which bears relevance to our concert topic by analogy. He said, quote, "Nobody just sits back and listens. Culture is baggage, and music cannot reach our ears except through a field of interpretation. The danger is not that thinking about such things distracts our ears from pure sensuous or aesthetic engagement. The danger is that once the thinking starts, it cannot be contained. It leads where it will, if we're mentally alive, and not always to the intended celebration." Thank you.
Comments, questions? Neil?
What are some of the countries, or all of the countries, probably not too many, I'm just curious, that did not sign on to the 1970s?
You know, I don't have those memorized, but I will get them to you if you ask me. But 131, that's quite a few, right? But I can get you that if you're interested. Yeah, you know, okay. Any other questions?
What the reasons would be for not signing on? But that's...
Well, you know, there are all sorts of obligations that flow with these agreements about what you're going to do with cultural property. In my view, cultural objects and their movement in international commerce, it's actually, the cultural world is shrinking on a national basis. And it may be that some countries just aren't aware, or I don't know the answer to that question. But we can explore that if you like. Any other questions? So, you know, not looted art is a big topic, of course. Very little research has been done on the topic of music. Yes?
Perhaps the most recent example of this is the destruction and the looting of the museums in Baghdad.
You're absolutely right.
And do we know were they looted or were they just smashed? Or some combination of both?
Well, in Baghdad, a lot of those things were returned, but a lot of them are still missing. And you know, the issue of illegal smuggling, you know, it's a huge problem.
Do we think that eventually Sotheby's is going to have a sort of unattributed,
I'm sorry, what?
unattributed Hittite figure that will bin from the Baghdad Museum? I mean, will it eventually just surface all over?
Well, you know what? Yeah, you know, one of the big issues, and that's a really good question, and this comes back to provenance with what I started talking about. You know what? We are, it is the custom in commerce, at auction houses and dealers, that provenance, the history of ownership and possession, you can't, it's not disclosed. It's often not disclosed. Now, this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, but I deal with this all the time, or I will see an instrument that changed hands during the war, for example, or it could be a manuscript, and you see property of a gentleman. And if you write and say, well, okay, but did it change hands in Europe during a certain time? Or you could have the same question with Syria or the Baghdad Museum. It's the industry custom is not transparent in terms of prior ownership and possession. But, you know, with the news and all of the looting that's gone on with antiquities, the UNESCO convention has actually a 1970 date, and the museum community has actually written voluntary regulations that if they can't prove the history of ownership after 1970, they will not acquire today. So, you know, it's actually a big issue. It's a lot is happening, but it's an important topic. But if you buy something, you should ask about where it came from. Yes?
I have to say, I mean, there's a lot of extraordinary sort of moments in your talk, but one that's spooky if you're a musicologist is normally when you see that blue stamp,
Yes.
it's a very reassuring
Right.
thing. It says, in effect, you know, you're dealing with the institution that validates the preservation of cultural property, and you look for those stamps, and it becomes part of your orderly world
Right.
of how things are supposed to work. So I wonder, do you have anything to say about the participation of musicology and archivists in this? In these specific cases where the German government was officially looting this stuff and actually putting it away in archives for musicologists to come later and look at.
Right. I think it's still a big problem, and I
Who would accession that stuff? Is it possible to know? There's a kind of historical guilt that I'm sort of...
Well, you know what? Different nations are doing different things. So Austria, for example, right now is going through a systematic process, the government, in looking at all of its public collections and investigating whether there were objects came into the collections that were looted and trying to return them if they were. So they have a big crew that's doing this across the fields. But different nations are different, and you know, if it's in private ownership as opposed to in a public collection, it's a whole different legal scenario.
I'm saying Sotheby's plays by one set of rules, but musicologists in our professional identity are actually, you can have a certain amount of conflict about, isn't this part of the history of our discipline?
Right. Well, you know what? I contributed to this book on the Feral Vogue manuscript, and I worked with a wonderful musicologist on that project and other musicologists who were involved with editing. And I was surprised. I mean, I think what I do is actually quite separate from what musicologists have been doing. And they weren't aware at all of where to look and what it meant. It's really a different field in a way. But it's very important.
Yeah, some of them don't want to look, right? You know, that whole period of, well, where was this manuscript between 1940, say, and 1945? Is a quite destabilizing question.
Right. And you know, archival access and restrictions on archival access continue to be a problem. So for me, I've been to many different countries. It's very, very difficult to do the research. There are many languages involved. You have to go to a lot of different places. It's hard to get the records. In some archives, they won't let you copy them. Here we are 70 years later. It's very challenging work. So there's a lot that could be done that's very important. Thank you for that question. Yes, Tamar.
I just want to ask about the distinction between personal property and cultural property, because I understand museums, because they are buying and it's about personal property, that it might be important to sign that. When you switch to cultural property, I was actually worried about this 1970 convention.
Yes.
Because it's very old-style anthropology with lots of assumptions about what a culture owns. So I wanted to ask you about that, the difference, personal property and what they're implying is culture.
You know, there's an example I like to use because, well, first of all, cultural property, this is kind of a national, it is a national concept, but it's also could be something that a person owns. I don't think there's a distinction. It sweeps in everything. However, if there are actions taken about recovering something or an issue, nations define what their cultural property is. There is some sovereignty issues involved here. But you know, you can have, and there is an example of a case file that I worked on involving a composer who fled to Lithuania. He was murdered there. His musical manuscripts are in the museum, and I helped, and the State Department tried to get the manuscripts back for the family. And you had the personal property rights of an individual, and your personal property rights are fundamental rights in the United States and in most other nations. And that can be pitted against a nation's rights to what they consider their cultural heritage. And I brought this up here thinking I wouldn't get to it, and you should stop me because I've probably gone over, but Bob and I have actually talked about this issue. The UNESCO Convention has a provision where if a stateless person, which would be a composer who'd fled to Lithuania, for example, composes on Lithuanian soil, under the law, and under the ownership law, under the 1970 UNESCO Convention, that would arguably be part of that nation's cultural heritage. So you do have a tension and a conflict with property rights that can come up. And in the case, in the file I was mentioning, the family, they refused to return it. So with music, they gave them copies. You could set the music free, but there's nothing like the object, the handwriting, the originals, and it's a different issue. Yes? Oh. Yeah. I'm sure I've gone over.
Yes, please.
Quick question. There was a sonata that was attributed to Mozart that a scholar then realized, no, it probably could not possibly have been written by Mozart because of the way that the motifs unravel across the thing, and compared them with manuscripts that Mozart had owned and written. Are there instances within this 4.0 study where you actually realize that something might not be part of our cultural heritage because it's not by the person we think it is?
Well, you're talking about authenticity, it sounds like. Is that right?
I suppose so. But is there an element of, like, let's say that there is something that was looted by the Nazis. They also thought it was by Mozart, but it's not. How, in your view, does that complicate that object's history?
Well, and we could use a manuscript too, since you're thinking about a manuscript. Well, if you boil it down to property concepts, and if it was stolen from someone, it doesn't really matter who the composer is, if it's somebody's property and they want to get it back. But part of the analysis always is it what it's supposed to be? Is it a Stradivari or is it a Mozart manuscript? And then what is the history of ownership? Just piecing together all of that to try and figure out, is this what they really lost? Did they lose a Mozart manuscript or did they lose something else? I mean, there's a lot of evidence that you have to put together to kind of put all those pieces together in that investigation. I don't know if I've answered your question. Okay. Thank you very much.